With the death of Leonid Brezhnev, about whom we spoke last time, passed away in 1982, and that year no one would have predicted that within a few years the Soviet Union was to embark on a course that would radically change the manner in which the country functioned, both internally as well as with regard to its relationships with the outside world. Powerful Soviet leader passes on, as we discussed before, kind of interregnum, but here the interregnum didn't go back to attempting collective leadership, but rather two successors immediately, one named Yuri Andropov, and then he passed on because of his illness, succeeded in 1984 by another person, Konstantin Chernenko, 80 years old. He passes on within a year or so. But then in 1985, when this octogenarian Chernenko died, within a few months after the end of his otherwise brief and nondescript rule or leadership, the Soviet Communist Party's ruling Politburo elected its youngest member, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. And he now took over the reins as General Secretary of the All-Union Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This Gorbachev provided a stark contrast to not only his immediate, but all of his Soviet predecessors, with perhaps the exception of Lenin. Gorbachev was well-educated, articulate, personable, exuding a sense of self-confidence and optimism. He went among the people, and believe it or not, he went among the people with his very talented, attractive, and accomplished wife, which was unheard of. Did Soviet leaders ever have wives? Never seen them, basically. And so he had, of course, he could do this because he had more self-confidence than any of the others, including Stalin. And this self-confidence and optimism inspired faith on the part of his supporters, and, at least initially, respect from his political adversaries, among whom there were not few. Within the first years of his rule after 1985, Gorbachev began to replace older officials with younger, more reform-minded types. And this was the first step toward creating a situation that would allow for the achievement of his primary goal. And what was his primary goal? To resuscitate, to revamp, to restart the Soviet economy. This is really what he wanted to do. Already during the last years of Brezhnev's rule, his predecessor, or two before predecessor, long-term predecessor, it was clear already by then, clear to many Soviet leaders that their country had entered a path of economic decline. And if that decline were to continue unchecked, it would be for long undermine the status of the Soviet Union as a world power. And so changes in the centralized command economy were essential if this seemingly inevitable trend toward economic decline was to be reversed. And this Gorbachev sounded, we can say, if you will, the clarion call for change. Change. And this was symbolized actually by two Russian words that subsequently entered the world's vocabulary. In those days, everyone suddenly heard of two Russian words. What are these two Russian words? And what they were: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika and glasnost. Restructuring and openness. Now, the restructuring referred primarily to the socioeconomic sphere. Now, it is true that Gorbachev was never strong on specifics, but he and his reform-minded advisors did seem intent on doing away with the centralized command economy and, if necessary, implementing some form of a free market system. Now, Gorbachev realized perestroika might be announced. I mean, the Soviets were always announcing some kind of plan, some kind of slogans, which were then pasted all over the country. But in order for it to succeed, the populace as a whole, from the farm worker to the factory worker, from the plant manager to the Communist Party functionary, all of them had to be drawn into the process and made to feel that they had a stake in its success. Now, in order to achieve such a radical transformation in people's minds and hearts, you know, people have been living in the Soviet Union for 75 years, or at least for 40 years. You're going to trust the system just because someone at the head of the system makes these proclamations? Not an easy thing. And so Gorbachev proclaims that the Soviet society must, from now on, be guided by the principle of glasnost, that is, openness, and a corollary to that, democratization. In effect, Soviet citizens were being encouraged to not only participate in debate, but to criticize their society. That didn't happen right away, hesitant, but when people began to realize that Gorbachev was indeed standing by his promise and promoting this glasnost, or openness, without any resort subsequently to police repression, suddenly all segments of the population, almost without restraint, began to criticize virtually every aspect of their country, from high-end economic policy to the incompetence of the people who pick up the garbage on the street. Gorbachev's efforts at domestic reforms were outmatched by the also complete reassessment or restructuring of the Soviet Union's relations with the outside world. Remember, at this time, one lived in a bipolar world. The West versus the East, symbolizes by the United States in the West, and the Soviet Union in the East, multi-nuclear powers. In this case, that is, the Soviet Union's relations with the outside world, it seemed that Gorbachev, the economic reformer, or trying to be, now was becoming Gorbachev, the political visionary. Soviet army troops were brought home from Afghanistan, where Brezhnev had sent them in to prop up a communist regime in Afghanistan and failed, like the United States and Vietnam a little bit earlier. And so now Gorbachev brings the troops home. Relations with the United States were dramatically improved as a result of Soviet willingness to reduce its military forces and its arsenal, nuclear arsenal. And most remarkable of all, the Kremlin effectively gave up its interest in what had been since World War II the very cornerstone of its policy in Europe, and that is control over the so-called Soviet satellite countries in Central Europe. This was a sine qua non for Stalin. What was the result of that? Well, that brought about what some have called the most momentous series of events since the French Revolution, literally 2 centuries before, and I'm referring here to the revolutions of 1989. When the Soviet Union declared that it was no longer willing to come to the aid of the so-called, or its so-called fraternal, brotherly communist regimes throughout Central Europe, the proverbial floodgates were opened. In 1989 alone, the Iron Curtain was raised as Hungary cut the barbed wire separating it from Austria. There's great photographs and then people walking over into Austria, into the quote, unquote, West. The Berlin Wall literally came crumbling down. Communist rule disintegrated in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Albania, Czechoslovakia, Romania. The Red Army that was stationed in many of those countries began to withdraw its forces from these former satellite countries. All these truly spectacular events occurred in large part because of the actions, whether he intended it or not is a different story, but certainly the actions of Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, back in the Soviet Union, or as they used to say, back in the USSR, Gorbachev's ultimate political masterstroke came in early 1990, the following year. Sensing that his efforts to push through further perestroika would continually be blocked by conservative-minded communists, and almost all of them were opposed to this kind of change, that would weaken their positions. And so, realizing that his efforts would be blocked, he arranged for the party, the Communist Party, to give up its monopoly on power and to invest even greater authority in the post of the president of the country, to which Gorbachev was reelected. These remarkable changes in Soviet political life inevitably were to have an impact and a profound impact on the various nationalities and national republics within the country. Kind of interesting that the seeming breakdown or self-imposed limitations on central authority actually led to inter-ethnic squabbles, for decades had been kind of held in check by Stalinist repression, and certainly continued under the Brezhnev years. But now without that strong control, breakout conflict, armed conflict between the Armenians and the Azeris in Azerbaijan, fighting over a territory called Nagorno-Karabakh. The Georgians clashed with one of the peoples living in the Georgian Republic, the Abkhazians. The Uzbeks in the far Central East or Central Asia attacked the Meshkerian Turks living in their midst. These interethnic passions such as these, as I said, resulted often in bloodshed and significant bloodshed. The Red Army tried to intervene, but not as strong, just to control them. That was then followed by an even more problematic scenario. The demand of certain Soviet republics for implementation of their constitutionally guaranteed right, which went back to the Soviet Constitution, both in its first 1924 and 1936 reiterations, that is the right of succession from the Union. And this most serious challenge was pressed most forcefully in the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that challenge reached crisis proportions in March 1990 when Lithuania unilaterally declared its independence. Now, even in those republics Soviet republics where political demands remained limited only to calls for decentralization and greater control over their own economy, kind of like economic autonomy, local leaders, especially from among the communist and non-communist affiliated intelligentsia, all responded enthusiastically to Gorbachev's call for glasnost. Now, the criticisms in these various republics focus largely on the need for making local languages official within their respective republics, for the full implementation of those languages at all levels of education and cultural life, for the rewriting of history so as to fill in so-called blank spots, Bili plamya, white spots, empty spots, what's referring here to the official Soviet versions of Soviet history and the history of each of these countries, republics past. More often than not, these blank spots dealt with events or personages who had struggled for independence from Tsarist Russian or from Soviet rule, and so they were literally whited out. One can actually trace this in published things. So the first edition of the Bolshevik, of the Soviet Encyclopedia had photographs of the original Soviet leaders, among them Trotsky. But then the second edition in the 1930s, same encyclopedia, same photograph, and Trotsky's not in the photograph. He was literally whited out. Echoes of glasnost, by the way, in Ukrainian, hlasnost, reached Soviet Ukraine as well. Ukraine's nationalist intelligentsia, patriotic intelligentsia led by writers and critics, people like Ivan Drach and Mikhail Horin. Drach was one of these members of the 60s group that we spoke about last time. In September 1989, they created something called the Popular Movement for Restructuring Ukraine. The Popular Movement for Restructuring Ukraine, for short, just came to be known as the movement. And the word in Ukrainian for that was Rukh. What was Rukh's basic goal? as quoted from their program, the rebirth and comprehensive development of the Ukrainian nation. Now, while Rukh emphasized the basic Ukrainian character of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, it also spoke out in defense of peoples of national and religious background living on Ukrainian territory that were not ethnic Ukrainian. So it was not ethnocentric. Despite its nationalist-oriented platform, Rukh did not call for independence, but rather hoped to encourage the transformation of the Soviet Union into a union of truly sovereign states, and to assure that Ukraine in that context could govern its economic affairs without any interference from Moscow, or for that matter from other republics. So to restructure, if you will, the Soviet Union in line with Gorbachev's call for perestroika. Even before the creation of Rukh and other Ukrainian nationalist-oriented organizations, and there were several, the Green Movement, Environmental Movement, the Shevchenko Society for Reviving the Ukrainian Language. So, but even before all of that, there was also movement on another sensitive front, that of religion and the church, jurisdiction of the church. Already in 1987, the hierarchy of the Greek Catholic Church in Western Ukraine, almost exclusively in the areas of Galicia and neighboring Transcarpathia, 1987, the hierarchy, even though banned, and many of the bishops were arrested, spent years in prison, exile, etc., nonetheless, there was an underground church and an underground hierarchy that functioned all throughout this period. And in 1987, it, so to speak, came out of the underground. It was backed by international pressure from the United States and other Western governments. I remember in a speech, the State of the Union speech of the President of the United States, which at the time was Ronald Reagan, he actually singled out the Greek Catholic Church. And so, with pressure from Western powers, as well as, not surprisingly, the Vatican, and also from Ukrainians living in the West and the diaspora, the Soviet government, which we know had outlawed the Greek Catholic Church in 1946, by late 1989, now under Gorbachev, agreed in principle to its re-legalization. Also, the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church that existed in the 1920s, banned by the Soviet powers since the early 1930s, also went into exile. It began the process of reconstitution in the summer of 1989, culminating 1 year later in June 1990 at a church council, a Sobor, which formally restored the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church hierarchy. Now, the existence of the Greek Catholic and the autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox churches in Ukraine, now re-legalized, proved to be a direct challenge to the Russian Orthodox Church under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Moscow. The Russian Orthodox Church, under this Moscow Patriarchate, was the only Eastern Christian church allowed to function legally in the Soviet Union. Note I say Eastern Christian, you could be Roman Catholic existed and Protestants existed, but for the Eastern Christians, only the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But now, its primacy was threatened, and in an attempt to retain the loyalty of its priests and parishioners, what had been the Ukrainian Exarchate, that is a branch of the mother church abroad, that's what Exarchate means. In 1989, its name is changed to a full-fledged official name, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So people would say, well, what do you mean? We're not a Russian Orthodox Church, we're a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Nothing really changed. It's the same thing. They're still under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, the result at the parish level was now a three-way struggle for the allegiance of Ukraine's Orthodox faithful, which made up the vast majority of the inhabitants of Ukraine. Most problematic in this three-way struggle was the question of property. Who had a right to control church property and to use church buildings? You can declare one thing, but then what? In the midst of this widespread intellectual, religious, and civic-minded ferment throughout Ukrainian society, an important turning point came in September 1989. Since everything is important in 1989, 1990. But in September 1989, this Volodymyr Shcherbytskyi, he was removed from his posts as head of the Communist Party of Ukraine and also as member of the Central Committee of the All-Soviet Communist Party in Moscow. Important, why? Because Shcherbytskyi was one of the last of the hard-line conservative opponents of Gorbachev's rule. And with the departure of Shcherbytskyi, political change now stepped up its pace, specifically in Soviet Ukraine. Things had been going on in Moscow already in 87, 88, but in the other republics much slower. Ukraine was one of the much slower to change, and that was because of Shcherbytskyi. But now Shcherbytskyi's gone. The following year, 1990, elections took place in March to Soviet Ukraine's parliament. These candidates that were supporters of Rukh formed a democratic bloc that won 100 seats in parliament. And then they joined forces with the so-called democratic sympathizers within the Communist Party, which was still the strongest. And together, they succeeded in having the parliament in July 1990 declare Ukraine a sovereign state. Again, not independent of the Soviet Union, but sovereign. And so by 1991, the formerly communist-dominated and Moscow loyalist Ukrainian parliament was in the forefront of this process in creating a legal and administrative infrastructure for a sovereign state. The parliament's work was made easier after the communists ceased to function as a unified voting bloc. Some, as I said, joined the opposition, in this case the Democratic bloc, in support of specific issues. And that change in direction of the parliament was due in large measures to a new chairman of the parliament, a man named Leonid Kravchuk. Leonid Kravchuk. He was a long-standing communist, actually was responsible for ideological matters, but he now quickly adapted to the more nationalist-minded mood of the people. Classic politician, you move literally with the wind as it blows. The question of Ukraine's relationship with the Soviet Union was finally decided in August 1991. So you can be a sovereign state. Okay, what does that mean? And what, number one, and number two, what about your relationship to the rest of the country to which you had belonged and still belong? Well, that was finally clarified in August 1991. This was a time when conservative political forces in Moscow itself, nothing to do with Ukraine per se, staged a coup, a putsch, which turned out to be unsuccessful. It lasted at most 3 days. Its object was to get rid of Gorbachev, this so-called reformer that is ruining everything in the Soviet Union. Kravchuk, quintessential politician, didn't react right away. He did not condemn the leaders of this failed putsch initially. But then, when he saw where the wind was blowing and this putsch wasn't going to succeed, he acted decisively. And on August 24th, 3 days later, he spearheaded a resolution in the parliament that declared Ukraine an independent state. August 24th, 1991. That declaration of independence in the parliament also called for a referendum on independence. If we're a new democratic world, we can make a declaration in parliament, but now let's ask the people. And so it was decided to hold a nationwide referendum 4 months later on December 1st, 1991. And the same day as that referendum on independence, if you're going to have an independent state, then you need a president. So there was simultaneously presidential elections. So the populace was asked to vote on whether Ukraine should be an independent state, and to choose from a list of candidates. And so from now, late August until December, which for September, October, November, Kravchuk enhanced his reputation as a defender of Ukraine's interests, now sovereign Ukraine's interests, now independent Ukraine's interests, by opposing Gorbachev's proposals for a new union treaty. Gorbachev wasn't sleeping. Now we have to preserve the Soviet Union. How are we going to do this? When the December 1st referendum was finally held, the results were a surprise even to the most ardent believers in independence. And why? No less than 92% of the country's inhabitants voted for independence. And over 80% in each of the supposedly completely Russified or largely Russified eastern industrial oblasts of Ukraine, like Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, even there over 80% voted for Ukraine's independence. And if that was not enough, in Crimea, which in September 1991 now officially had its own state sovereignty, but within Ukraine, even there 54% of the eligible voters voted in favor of independence. And as for the presidential elections, which took place on the same day, Kravchuk won a comfortable majority of 62% of the vote. And so now Ukraine is independent, and it has its own government. This first step in independence, the declaration, on August 24th, 1991, to sum up now much of what we've been speaking about, that declaration actually marked no less than the 6th time in the course of the 20th century that independence had been proclaimed on all or part of Ukrainian territory. The conditions surrounding the Declaration of Independence in 1991 differed significantly from those previous earlier declarations. Whether those declarations took place right after World War I, first in Kyiv, then in Lviv with the West Ukrainian National Republic, then again in Kyiv, or on the eve of and during World War II, first in Khust in Carpatho, Ukraine in 1939, then the abortive declaration in Lviv in 1941. The point is that all of these previous attempts at independence, as I said, whether they applied to Ukraine as a whole or to one of its parts, had come at a time of civil war, or civil war and invasion by foreign powers. Moreover, on previous occasions, Ukraine's inhabitants had been consulted only in part or not at all as to their views on these declarations of independence. But all was different in 1991. Ukraine may still have been part of an empire, but an empire in devolution or dissolution. But that process was essentially a peaceful one, in which, ironically, the old communist elite participated along with significant segments of the population. And because of the power of the modern media, everything was taking place under the watchful and sometimes approving eye of the world. This declaration of independence by parliamentary representatives was then, as we've just seen, legitimized through a referendum in which 80% of eligible voters participated, with a result of 92% for. And that referendum had both outside international and inside observers, all of whom agreed that it was conducted in accord with generally accepted democratic practices. And the results were almost immediately welcomed by the international community. Independent Ukraine, now independent Ukraine, retained its status as a full-fledged member of the United Nations, and within a few weeks, it was recognized by most of the leading countries in the world community. And finally, the fact that 9 out of every 10 inhabitants approved independence confirmed that Ukrainian statehood was the wish not only of Ukrainian nationalists. In effect, an independent Ukraine seemed to promise the most attractive alternative for all those who wanted change. And by the way, everyone wanted change. Whether that change need to be in politics, in the economy, in the environment, in the cultural life, or all of these areas. Now, it is true that declarations of independence and the achievement of internationally recognized statehood, those are nice, but they do not in themselves resolve the old problems and may even create new problems. For example, what was to be Ukraine's precise relationship to Russia and to the other former Soviet republics that now became part, or some of them became part of a loose alliance known as the Commonwealth of Independent States? This was the desire of Gorbachev. Would Ukraine adopt a unitary or a federal state structure? Now have to have a new constitution, and what would this country look like? Would the economy develop along largely free market principles? Or would a variant of state socialism be adopted? Would new cultural and educational policies be implemented to reduce the decline in Ukrainian language use and to transform the individual's identification with things Ukrainian into a source of pride and self-esteem? In other words, could that old and still existing heritage of Little Russianism, which considered Ukrainianism as a lower stage in a hierarchy of multiple loyalties, could that attitude feeling finally be overcome? These were only some of the many problems which faced the citizens of this newly independent Ukraine in 1991. Perhaps for the first time, however, Ukrainians would have the opportunity to resolve their problems on their own. We are not going to look into the next 30 years to see how they have been challenged in their attempts to resolve those problems. So on that note, I thank you all for spending this semester with me in this course. I hope that you finish off this semester and are successful in whatever next stage of your personal and academic career may be. So all the best to all of you. And again, thank you.